Welcome back, beautiful, beloved souls. My name is Gem Stone. I'm a psychic medium and I am an author. On this channel, you will find I mainly do commentaries where I look at anything to do with life and death through a lens, hence the name of the channel. Now, I've been away from doing my normal topics for quite some time. I took a break, although I have uploaded stuff about jewelry scams. But today I am back with my normal consciousness philosophical focus. And this one is really strange. And I would really appreciate it if you could share the video, because I wonder if you have ever thought about this. Can everything actually end? I've had some very strange dreams in my life. Not just strange in the ordinary sense of dreams being strange. I mean dreams that stay with me for years. I'm a very vivid dreamer, and I can remember some dreams almost as though they actually happened. And every now and then, I've had a dream about the end of everything. Not the end of humanity, not the end of Earth, not even the end of the universe. Something much bigger than that. The end of existence itself. And recently, I had another one. So, I thought I'd take you down a bit of a philosophical rabbit hole with me. This isn't a prediction. It isn't a warning about nuclear war. It isn't me telling you that I've discovered some terrible secret about reality. It's really just a question. Can everything actually end? One of the strangest dreams I've ever had involved what I can only describe as a god of evil. I was facing this enormous entity, and somehow I understood that if it consumed me, that wasn't simply the end of my life, it was the end of Source itself. The end of creation, the end of creativity, the end of the Creator, the end of everything that could possibly exist. And then there would be nothing. But it's not the kind of nothing we normally mean when we say nothing. We can imagine an empty room. We can imagine an empty planet. We can imagine an empty universe. But all of those things are still something. There is still space. There is still time. There is still the possibility that something could happen. The nothingness in this dream was much more extreme. There wasn't even the possibility of anything happening. And that is something I don't think the human mind can actually picture. Because the moment you try to imagine absolute nothing, you're imagining it. And therefore, you've already put something there. A thought, an observer, a concept. So, perhaps absolute nothing is impossible for a conscious being to experience. And then this morning, I had another dream, and this one was completely different. There were infinite worlds, and nuclear destruction was spreading through them. You could try to escape by moving between dimensions, but it didn't work. There was nowhere to go. And the really strange part wasn't the destruction itself. It was that it seemed to be a consensual decision. The entities within these realities had somehow decided that they wanted to end existence. They wanted to break the bonds that held reality together. They didn't simply want to destroy a particular universe. They wanted to end the whole thing. And that got me thinking, because we normally assume that if there are infinite possibilities, then there must be always somewhere else to go. Another universe, another dimension, another timeline, another incarnation, another reality, another possibility. But what if there were a point where there was nowhere else? What if the destruction didn't happen inside reality? What if it happened to reality itself? And this brings me to a really strange distinction. What do we actually mean by the end? Imagine the universe suddenly disappeared. No stars, no planets, no people, nothing. We might call that the end. But it isn't necessarily absolute nothing. There could still be space. There could still be time. There could still be physical laws. There could still be quantum fields. There could still be the potential for another universe to emerge. So perhaps that's not really the end. Then imagine something more extreme. There is no universe, no space, no time, no matter, no energy, no consciousness, nothing. That's closer to what we mean by absolute nothing. But then there's an even stranger possibility. What if there wasn't even the possibility of anything? No possibility of another universe. No possibility of consciousness returning. No possibility of creation. No possibility of time beginning again. No possibility of anything ever happening. Ever. And I think that's where language starts to fail us. Because we're trying to describe something that, by definition, contains nothing to describe. Now here's where it gets really interesting. I have always been fascinated by the idea of infinite possibilities. If reality is infinite, then perhaps there are an infinite number of things that can happen. Infinite universes, infinite versions of ourselves, infinite histories, infinite futures, infinite ways reality could unfold. But if that's true, does absolute annihilation exist somewhere within those possibilities? And if it does, what happens to the infinity? Because if absolutely everything ends, then there aren't any possibilities left. Infinity, let me get that right. Infinity has somehow collapsed into zero. And that's a fascinating paradox. Maybe absolute annihilation isn't another possibility within reality. Maybe it would have to be something that happens to the entire possibility space itself. And that's a much stranger idea. There is another assumption we often make, and that is the idea that consciousness continues forever. Many spiritual traditions have some version of this. The body dies, but consciousness continues. The soul continues. Perhaps it moves somewhere else. Perhaps it reincarnates. Perhaps it returns to source. Perhaps it becomes part of something much larger. And I find those ideas fascinating. But I've been wondering about something else. What if consciousness isn't necessarily eternal? What if consciousness can arise and eventually cease? Not because someone has been punished, not because something has gone wrong, but because consciousness is itself part of the process of creation. And if creation can begin, perhaps creation can also end, which leads to a rather uncomfortable question. Could existence itself have an off switch? This also reminds me of a book I channeled and published called The Maurs, M-A-U-R-S. The Maurs are beings that, from a human perspective, might be described as something like spiders or artificial intelligences. But even that description isn't really inadequate. We're using human language to describe something that isn't human. In the story, they have a relationship with what we might call music, but it isn't human music. It's much more like frequency, mathematics, and patterns of information. And they have the ability to create and uncreate. Now, uncreate is a fascinating word because we usually think about creation and destruction as opposites. Something is created, then it can be destroyed. But destruction doesn't necessarily mean that the thing has ceased to exist completely. If I burn a piece of paper, the paper is gone. But its atoms hasn't disappeared, they've changed. Matter has been rearranged. Energy has been transformed. So, perhaps destruction isn't really the opposite of creation. Perhaps it's another transformation. But what would uncreate mean? What if it wasn't changing something into something else? What if it meant removing it from the structure of reality altogether. Imagine that reality is like an enormous piece of mathematical music. We exist within it. Everything we know is part of the composition. Galaxies, stars, planets, bodies, thoughts, consciousness, maybe even time itself. Creation would be adding a new pattern, and destruction would be changing or breaking an existing pattern. But uncreation might mean removing the pattern completely, so completely that there is no trace of it remaining. And then we reach the question I keep coming back to. Could the entire composition be uncreated? Not just the music, not just the instruments, not just the listeners, but the possibility of music itself. And here's something else I find fascinating about my dream. The entities didn't seem to be trying to escape death. They were choosing to end. That changes the philosophical question completely. We normally think of annihilation as something imposed upon us. We fear death because we don't want to stop existing. We fear nuclear war because we don't want humanity to disappear. We fear the end of the universe because we assume existence is something we want to preserve. But imagine a consciousness so advanced that it could look at existence and say, we've experienced enough. What if the purpose of existence isn't necessarily to continue forever? What if existence is an experience? And what if an experience can eventually be complete? We tend to think that something lasting forever makes it more meaningful. Maybe the opposite is true. Maybe something can be meaningful precisely because it doesn't last forever. And then there's another problem. If everything really ended, would anyone know? If there were no consciousness left, there would be nobody to witness the ending, nobody to say, it's over, nobody to remember that anything ever existed. There wouldn't even be a past, because time itself might no longer exist. So perhaps absolute annihilation isn't an event, because an event requires time. And an event requires something that experiences the event. Maybe the absolute end isn't something that happens. Maybe it is the absence of anything that could ever happen. And honestly, I find that far stranger than any apocalypse story. But here's where I want to bring this back to imagination, because I don't know whether any of this is true. I don't know whether consciousness survives death. I don't know whether there are infinite universes. I don't know whether dimensions exist beyond the ones we experience. I don't know whether source exists, and I certainly don't know whether reality has an off switch. I'm not presenting this as fact. I'm asking a question, because sometimes I think we're becoming so accustomed to asking questions that have answers that we forget how interesting an unanswered question can be. And this one may be impossible to answer, because we're asking a conscious mind to imagine the absence of consciousness. We're asking something that exists to imagine non-existence. We're asking a universe that contains possibilities to imagine the complete absence of possibility. Perhaps that's why my dreams keep circling around it. Maybe the human imagination can walk right up to the edge of something that the conscious mind cannot cross. So here's the question I'd like to leave you with. We've spent an enormous amount of time wondering whether the universe is infinite, whether consciousness is infinite, whether souls are infinite, whether there are infinite dimensions, whether there are infinite versions of ourselves. But what if we asked the opposite question? Is there a point where everything stops? Not humanity, not Earth, not our universe. Everything. No creator, no creation, no consciousness, no mathematics, no dimensions, no time, no possibility, nothing. And if such a state is possible, then perhaps the strangest question isn't what happens when everything ends. Perhaps it's, can there ever be an end if there is nobody and nothing left to experience it? I don't know. But I find and I think that's exactly why I find this so fascinating. Sometimes the most interesting places to explore are the ones where our imagination reaches the edge of the map and there are no more words written beyond it. What do you think? Can everything actually end? Or is there something about existence itself that makes absolute annihilation impossible? I genuinely would love to read what you think, and perhaps I'll see you down the rabbit hole again. Could I ask if you drop a comment, please do so respectfully. If only the world was more respectful, less judgmental, more tolerant, what a better place it would be. Please be kind to each other, smile at a stranger, you might just save a life. Take care of yourselves because you matter. And join me again when I come back. I won't be doing this every day, but I will be back. Thanks for watching. Love, light, and blessings. Bye.